Hello and welcome along. So we're going to talk about the Iron Cage. The Iron Cage is the name given to one of the largest battles fought between Astartes after the Horus heresy. So it was fought between the Imperial Fists led by Rebel Dorn and the Iron Warriors led by Perturabo. The battle took place immediately following the Horus heresy on the planet of Sebastus IV. The Imperial Fists assaulted a planet defended by the Iron Warriors, who had built an extensive fortress system on the planet in preparation for an attack by the Imperial Fists. And they named this complex the Eternal Fortress. Dorn, on hearing about it, felt that he needed to destroy it, capture Perturabo, and bring him back to Terra in a, quote, iron cage. And that's where the battle got its name, the Iron Cage. So a little background to why this happened. So, of course, it's well known that the two Primarchs, Perturabo and Dorn, had a long-standing rivalry. Now, this started back in the Great Crusade, where both legions possessed a similar speciality in construction of fortifications and siege warfare. And this led to a rivalry that perhaps started as a friendly rivalry, but grew more and more bitter. Certain people, Horus, Fulgrim, did play Dorn and Perturabo off against each other. Perturabo's quite deeply bitter character led to him always interpreting events in a negative way. Dorn's character of being very stoic, very quiet, not one given to tact, led to him not really handling the situation very well either. And so the rivalry just grew more and more bitter over the period of the Great Crusade. Now, eventually, Dorn would be given the incredible honor by the Emperor of fortifying the Imperial Palace. And that really tipped the rivalry over the edge, particularly from Perturabo's side. Famously, Fulgrim had a conversation with Dorn where he asked him, could the defenses of the Imperial Palace be defeated by any opposition? And he said no, as long as it was sufficiently manned. And Fulgrim then sort of teased Perturabo with this in a way and essentially said, Dorn says you couldn't break this, you couldn't defeat his fortress, which sent Perturabo into an incredible rage, which it was so extraordinarily violent and vitriolic that people couldn't even believe what they'd seen. So you can see the deep, deep level of bitterness that Perturabo had developed against Dorn. Now, of course, eventually the Horus heresy would begin, and this is where that deep, bitter rivalry could become actual violence, where the legions would face each other in many relatively minor battles, some larger though, but eventually culminating in the Siege of Terra, where Dorn commanded the defense and Perturabo commanded the assault. Now, this, of course, resulted in the traitor forces being defeated and driven off. But the way it happened really left Perturabo with a feeling of being let down by his allies. With Horus dying, killed by the Emperor, this led to the traitor forces sort of breaking up. But Perturabo felt that if he had the time, he could have eventually won. And there is probably reasonable evidence to suggest that that's true. Well, Dorn, from his perspective, was left with a very deep hatred of Perturabo and this desire to pursue him and drive the Iron Warriors off of every world they conquered. Well, shortly after the siege, he began this task. So Perturabo was determined to get some revenge on Dorn for taking back these worlds that he had conquered, for the fact that he hadn't been able to complete the conquest of the Imperial Palace, which he felt had been robbed from him. All of the old rivalry that they developed over the years of the Great Crusade. And so what he did is he built a fortress complex which was designed purposely as a trap for the Imperial Fists and Dorn. So it was an extensive multi-layered system of fortresses that covered a huge area, something like over 32 square kilometers, it said, that's 20 miles, included bunkers, towers, minefields, trenches, tank traps, gun emplacements, and a very complex system of underground tunnels and deep bunkers. By now, Perturabo and the Iron Warriors had moved closer towards chaos. They built it in a 8-pointed star shape. And then at the very center of this complex, they built a huge command center. However, this command center was in fact a dummy. Now, once Dorn discovered that the Iron Warriors had built this fortress and were laying in wait for him, begging to be attacked, he couldn't help but go there. He was by now very uncharacteristically personally, emotionally involved in this quest to capture or defeat Perturabo, and he let that get the better of him. So he went to the planet, and against all advice, including advice from Guilliman, who told him he wasn't going to be able to win this battle, and that it would take at least 2 legions to defeat the defences arrayed against them, he decided to attack anyway. Now, as well as his hatred for Perturabo and this deep desire to try and finally bring some justice to the traitors, Dorn also had come to the conclusion that his legion needed to go through some great trial, some pain, to purge themselves of their past and test themselves for the future. This was something that he felt was necessary to prepare them for becoming Codex compliant. Now, I've done a separate video on how the second founding came about and the effects it had on the different legions, and in that video I talked about how Dorn was one of the most resistant to this idea because he didn't like the idea of the legion being broken up, and the Codex required the legions to be broken up into 1,000 strong chapters. However, he did eventually come round to the idea, very reluctantly, essentially to avoid another conflict within the Imperium, and he decided that this battle would be a way of transitioning the legion mentally through the process and make them ready to be divided up and turned into Codex compliant chapters. So knowing that the legion would suffer heavy casualties, he nonetheless decided to press the attack. He started with a quite poorly planned orbital bombardment, which was quite ineffective, as Perturabo had predicted the attack and had withdrawn his troops into these deep bunkers. Perturabo then activated a large missile defense system that was designed to drive off an attacking fleet. Seeing that this had been activated, the Imperial Fists had to launch a ground assault quickly to protect their fleet from being destroyed by these ground defences. However, this was also part of the Perturabo's plan, and he then detonated the whole missile complexes, which created a massive radiation clouds that blocked out Vox traffic from the fleet to the ground forces, so it isolated them. At this point, he then launched an attack by his own fleet on the Imperial Fist fleet. Now, the Iron Warrior fleet, though, however, was packed full of Iron Warriors, and the Imperial Fist fleet was essentially empty. They had sent every available Astarte down to the ground, or almost everyone, to take part in this assault. Again, a sign of how reckless Dorn had become. And so, because the Imperial Fist fleet were virtually undefended from boarding actions, the Iron Warriors were victorious, and they were able to drive off the Imperial Fist fleet, which was broken and scattered and had taken very heavy casualties. So now the Imperial Fist forces on the ground were isolated from their fleet, which had been scattered, and so they had to press home this assault. Now, Perturabo personally commanded the defense via a massive fortified command tower, and he observed a huge wave of Imperial Fists launching a direct frontal assault. So there was no real finesse to the Imperial Fist's plan, or for Dorn's plan. It was just charge in and kill these Iron Warriors. And so the complexity, the multi-layered nature of the defenses that Perturabo had built were so extensive, so well placed, that they very quickly managed to eliminate the Imperial Fist's armoured elements. So with tank traps, mines, gun emplacements, they destroyed essentially all of the Imperial Fist's armour, leaving the infantry isolated and pinned down. But due to the very stoic nature of the Imperial Fist and Dorn's really deep, incredible determination to break through, the Imperial Fist's infantry were able to force their way through the outer perimeter of the Eternal Fortress. However, in doing so, they realised that this was also a trap. They were being allowed to make ground by sacrificing huge numbers of casualties, but also to be drawn further and further into a trap. Over time, they were isolated, broken up, drawn into dead ends, spread out across this whole area of the Eternal Fortress, broken up into small groups, only perhaps company size or even smaller squad size, and just systematically eliminated. Eventually, this led to the Imperial Fist being on the verge of total defeat, of being completely annihilated. Dorn had to personally intervene on multiple occasions to stop a total defeat, and the remaining Astartes had almost no ammunition left. They were down to fighting with their knives. They were using the bodies of their own fallen comrades as barricades. it was a hopeless situation, and they essentially begged Dorn to let them retreat, but he just would not give in, and he forced them to keep fighting. And this went on for several weeks, 3 weeks and 6 days or something it was supposed to have been, to the point where the Iron Warriors were essentially playing with the Imperial Fists. They had them at their mercy, but they didn't finish them off. They extended the time of which they were suffering. And this is believed to be Perturabo basically reveling in the destruction of the Imperial Fists and the suffering of Dorn. Seeing Dorn defeated, seeing his legion defeated, seeing him fail. And this was something that Perturabo had longed for decades. And so he didn't want it to be over quickly. So he toyed with his enemy. However, he did it a bit too long. And eventually, despite protests from the Imperial Fists, the Ultramarines under Robert Guilliman would intervene. Now, an entire second legion joining the attack meant that the Iron Warriors could no longer hold the fortress, or at least if they did, they would face having taken huge casualties themselves. So they decided to withdraw, and they did so relatively intact and left the devastated Imperial Fists to be rescued by the Ultramarines. Now, I should say there is an alternative theory that the Iron Warriors simply just lacked the determination to finish off the Imperial Fists. Now, I find this idea ridiculous, to be honest. The Iron Warriors are renowned for determination. Perturabo's hatred of Dorn is so intense, his hatred for the Imperial Fists so intense. The idea that they simply couldn't find it within themselves to finish off this force of Imperial Fists who had been reduced to almost nothing. They were, scattered individuals and small groups spread across a vast area, completely at the mercy of Perturabo and the Iron Warriors. They couldn't find the internal fortitude to finish them off. It's just ridiculous. Now, of course, it's an embarrassing event for the Imperial Fist. It's an embarrassing event for the Imperium. It's an embarrassing event for Dorn. So you can imagine that stories would need to be created to explain how the quite a large remaining force of Imperial Fists who could have been very useful in rebuilding the Imperium after the heresy was suddenly reduced to a few thousand Astartes. And so naturally, alternative explanations would appear to what really happened. But it is obviously very clear that it's Dorn's terrible need for revenge and his incompetence as a commander that has led to this disaster. And the fact that a very small number of them managed to survive is nothing to do with Perturabo and the Iron Warriors not being able to find it within themselves to finish them off. And it's clearly Perturabo's need to draw out his revenge on Dorn to get the maximum satisfaction. And you could argue his own incompetence as a commander, because he could have finished them off and been done with, but he needed to sate his personal need for vengeance just as Dorn did. And so both Perturabo and Dorn put their personal needs above their legion's needs. In Dorn's case, that led to them being effectively wiped out, and in Perturabo's case, it led to them not getting the absolute final victory they could have had. But ultimately, of course, the Iron Warriors came out of this engagement far better than the Imperial Fist did. And if it hadn't been for the timely intervention of the Ultramarines, they would have been defeated completely. So the aftermath of the battle really was the Iron Warriors being victorious. They had proven their superiority over the Imperial Fists, and Perturabo had proven his superiority as a commander over Dorn. Now, of course, Dorn was not behaving like Dorn usually does. He made the Imperial Fists behave in a way that they would normally not behave. So they were far more reckless than they would normally be, and this was the main factor in their defeat. However, that was what Perturabo had created. He had created this situation where Dorn would feel the desperate need to attack him, and he could draw him further and further into a trap that could not be escaped from. And without Guilliman intervening, there would be no more Imperial Fists, no more Dorn. On top of this, Perturabo captured so much gene seed from the Imperial Fist that he was able to bargain his way into being made a Demon Prince by the Powers of Chaos, which is a lovely bonus. And from Dorn's perspective, he did certainly purge his legion with pain. I mean, the very few Astartes that survived were very much affected by this psychologically. You could argue that they were kind of forged in fire, and the ones that survived were much tougher, much harder mentally. They'd come through something so terrible, yet they had survived. And so these remaining few thousand Astartes that went on to become the second founding successors of the Imperial Fists were better than they would otherwise have been. And so perhaps Dorn's idea of it being used to transition them from the Legion into these new chapters was, in a sense, successful, but he did lose many, many more Astartes than he had expected to. And the battle would go down as a stain on the honor of the Legion and the successor chapters for generations. Now, of course, it's 40k. We don't really know what numbers were involved. There's no clear numbers given about how many Astartes went into the battle from the Imperial Fists at the beginning, but it can be estimated probably at something like 30,000, give or take 10,000. They're supposed to be at Legion strength, although at low Legion strength, because obviously they've taken heavy casualties during the Horus Heresy and finally at the Siege of Terror, and this is not long after that. So they probably don't have much time to recover any new recruits. So that's probably about as many as there can be, around 30,000. And certainly at the end of it, they are down to a few thousand, depending on how many successor chapters you believe actually existed at the second founding for the Imperial Fist, but it's probably 4 or 5 at most. And so that would make them about 5,000, let's say, Astartes. So incredible losses, and really took the Legion from being relevant to almost non-relevant. So it has to go down as a huge mistake by Dorn, I think, and a massive win for Perturabo. Okay, so that's the Iron Cage. Let me know what you think in the comments. Was Dorn right to go into this battle, which was clearly a trap planned by Perturabo? Does this battle change your perception of Dorn? Does it damage his reputation? Do you think that Guilliman was right to intervene and rescue the Imperial Fists, or should he have followed their wishes and let them die? For me, what stood out from this battle was also the incredible level of loyalty that the Imperial Fists had to Dorn. He put them in a terrible situation. He forced them to keep fighting until the bitter end. And from their perspective, that bitter end would have been total annihilation, the extinction of the Legion, the loss of the Primarch, the end of their story. And yet, though they asked him to retreat, they didn't ever disobey his orders. He said, no, we're going to keep fighting. And that's what they did. They kept fighting, and they resisted the attempts of the Ultramarines to help them. It wasn't just Dorn saying, no, don't come and rescue us. It was the Imperial Fist saying, no, this is our fight. We've got to fight to the end because our Primarch is telling us to, and that's it. The loyalty characteristics within the personality of an Imperial Fist are right at the top of all the Legion, and their loyalty to Dorn is completely unquestionable. It is yet another one of the tragedies of the 40k universe where a Primarch does something really bad and stupid, and their legionaries have to suffer for it, despite it being not their fault in any way. That is the grimdark nature of 40k. So as always, let me know what you think in the comments. It'd be great to hear what you think. And if you haven't already, like, subscribe and share. And I will see you next time.